She was seconds from death. He was supposed to be invisible. One man dove forward while an entire company froze, and nothing at Ashford Industries would ever be the same again. If this is your first time here, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because the man they called just a janitor was about to change everything. Night. The rain had been falling since before Mason Calloway clocked in at 4:30 in the morning. It was the kind of rain that didn't announce itself. No thunder, no drama, just a low gray sky pressing down on the city like a wet hand leaking steadily onto everything below. By 6 a.m., the loading dock behind Ashford Industries' main facility had turned into a sheet of standing water, dark and slick, where the drainage grates had been clogged for weeks. Mason had written that up in a maintenance report. Twice. The second report was dated 11 days ago. He still had the carbon copy folded in the breast pocket of his uniform, the way he kept most things he suspected would matter later. He was pushing a mop cart around the corner of the east corridor when he heard the sound. It wasn't loud. That was the part that stayed with him afterward, how quiet the whole thing was. A small squeal of wet rubber, a short, sharp intake of breath, and then the unmistakable acceleration of something that should have been slowing down, instead, doing the opposite. Mason dropped the cart handle and moved. He didn't think about it. Thinking came later in the break room when his hands had finally stopped trembling and he was staring into a cup of coffee he couldn't taste. In the moment itself, there was no decision, just his body reacting to what his eyes registered before his brain fully caught up. The woman in the wheelchair, the wet slope of the loading dock, and the 6-lane street at the bottom where the morning traffic was moving fast and indifferent and completely unaware. He hit the side rail of the dock running, grabbed the back handle of the chair with both hands, and dug his heels into the wet concrete. His boots skidded. His shoulder slammed into the dock's rusted barrier post hard enough to send a white bolt of pain through his collarbone. The chair lurched. For one long second they were both still moving. Him, her, the chair, all of it sliding in the same terrible direction. And then friction won, barely, and everything stopped. The front wheels of the chair were hanging over the edge of the dock. 6 inches, maybe 8. Mason stood there, breathing hard, both hands still locked on the chair's handles, rain running down the back of his neck. He could feel the woman in the chair breathing too, fast and shallow, the kind of breathing that happens when your body understands what almost happened before your mind does. "You're okay," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a comfort exactly. It was just the truest thing he could say. He pulled the chair back from the edge slowly, turned it, and set it on level ground. That was when he noticed the people. There were maybe 15 of them, dock workers, 2 guys in suits who'd clearly just arrived for an early meeting, a woman with a clipboard frozen in the doorway. They were all standing there, staring. Nobody had moved. Not one of them had taken a single step toward the edge of that dock. Mason looked at them for a moment. Then he looked down at the dock surface, at the dark streaked water running toward the drain, and at the wheel groove where the chair had picked up speed. "That drain's been backed up for almost 2 weeks," he said, mostly to the room, though his voice was flat and factual rather than accusatory. "Water pool's right at the top of the ramp. Someone needs to clear it today, not next week." Then he went back and got his mop cart. Her name was Evelyn Ashford, and she had not been frightened in a long time. That wasn't bravado. Fear, for Evelyn, had been a luxury she'd quietly stopped allowing herself somewhere around the time she turned 28 and realized that every room she walked into, rolled into, was already making decisions about her before she opened her mouth. The wheelchair was 11 years old now, a custom titanium frame that cost more than most people's cars, and she had long since stopped thinking of it as a symbol of anything. It was a tool. It got her where she needed to go, but her hands were shaking. She sat in her private office on the 14th floor and looked at her hands and thought about 8 inches of empty air above a 6-lane street, and she let herself shake for exactly 90 seconds. Then she put both palms flat on the desk, pressed down until she felt the solid weight of the mahogany, and breathed. Her assistant, Daniel, knocked twice and opened the door without waiting, which was the arrangement they had. "The board wants a statement," he said, "about the incident." "Tell them there's no incident. Tell them maintenance cleared a drainage issue on the east dock." Daniel looked at her the way he sometimes did when he thought she was being strategically incomplete. He was 26, Yale MBA, and still young enough to be surprised when powerful people chose simplicity over spectacle. "The man," she said. "The one who—" She stopped. "Who is he?" "Mason Calloway, night shift custodial. He's been with the company about 3 years. Does he have a supervisor?" "Phil Garrett, facilities." "Get me his file." She paused. "Not Phil's, the other one." Mason's file was 43 pages, which was longer than most custodial files by about 40 pages. Evelyn read it in the car on the way to her next meeting, and then she read it again in the parking garage before going in, which was something she hadn't done with a document in years. He was 36, born in Raleigh, North Carolina. He'd attended North Carolina State on a partial mechanical engineering scholarship. Strong grades, a professor's recommendation letter that used the phrase natural spatial intelligence in a way that clearly meant something specific, and had withdrawn in his 3rd year without completing his degree. The withdrawal was dated 2 weeks after a death certificate. His wife, Caroline Calloway, 29 years old, cause of death listed as complications following emergency surgery. He had a daughter. Her name was Lily. She was 8. Evelyn set the file down on the car seat and looked out the window at the gray parking structure for a while. Then she picked it back up and turned to the maintenance reports section, because something had caught her eye on the first read, and she wanted to look at it again. Over the course of 3 years, Mason Calloway had submitted 19 formal maintenance reports. 4 of them had been processed. The other 15 were stamped, "Received," and nothing else. She read through 3 of the unprocessed reports in full. The first one, from 14 months ago, outlined a corroding support issue in the East Wing HVAC mounting system and included a proposed fix using a modified bracket configuration that the report estimated would cost $400 per unit versus the standard replacement cost of $2,200. The language was careful, measured, and technically precise in a way that had nothing to do with a custodial job description. The second one proposed a rerouting of the loading dock drainage system that would eliminate the pooling problem entirely for less than $800 in materials and 1 day of labor. It was dated 11 months ago. The third one she almost missed. It was tucked at the back, a 4-page handwritten addendum attached to a report about the building's aging electrical routing. The addendum outlined a phased approach to the facility's entire infrastructure grid that used language Mason had clearly borrowed from engineering journals, quietly and precisely, the way someone who has been reading in the margins of their actual life reads. She flipped to the back page, in small, neat handwriting at the bottom. Note: I understand this falls outside the scope of this report. I included it in case anyone finds it useful. Evelyn Ashford sat with that for a long time. What? The meeting where it started was a Tuesday. Phil Garrett from Facilities had told Mason to expect a general infrastructure review and to bring whatever documentation he had on the East Wing systems. Mason had shown up with a manila folder, a thermos of coffee, and the vague feeling that he'd done something wrong without knowing what. The conference room on the 12th floor was the kind of room that had been designed to make certain people feel small. All glass on one side, the city spread out below it like a map of everything the people in this room had access to. The table was long and oval, and the chairs around it probably cost $300 each. Mason sat in one of those chairs and thought about how it wasn't as comfortable as it looked. There were 8 people in the room. He recognized 2 of them from their company photos. Grant Mercer, the chief operations officer, who was maybe 50 and had the specific kind of physicality that comes from spending a lot of time being the tallest person in every room, and Diane Wu, head of facilities engineering, who had once passed Mason in the hallway without making eye contact in a way that suggested it wasn't accidental. The others were a mix of department heads and people whose badges identified them as belonging to departments Mason had never thought about. Evelyn Ashford came in last, which he understood later was deliberate. She moved through the room the way she seemed to move through everything. Without fuss, without performance, just the quiet, efficient motion of someone who had long ago decided that getting from point A to point B was what mattered, and everything else was noise. She took her position at the head of the table and looked around the room once, briefly, and when her gaze crossed Mason, she gave him something that wasn't quite a smile, more like a small acknowledgement, the way you might acknowledge someone you'd seen in a particular circumstance and hadn't forgotten. He looked back at his folder. "We're going to talk about the East Wing project," Evelyn said. "The modernization proposal that's been sitting on the table since February. But first I want to hear from Mason Calloway about the maintenance assessments he's been submitting." The silence that followed was the kind that had texture to it. Grant Mercer's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it rearranged itself. He looked at Mason the way someone looks at an object that's been placed somewhere it doesn't belong. "I don't think that's necessary," Grant said. "This meeting is for department heads." "Mason," Evelyn said, as if Grant hadn't spoken. Mason looked up. "Walk us through what you found in the East Wing HVAC system." He opened the folder. Later, he would not be able to tell you that he felt confident in that room. That would be a cleaner version of the story than what actually happened. What actually happened was that he kept his voice steady by focusing on the materials in front of him, by talking about numbers and schematics and load tolerances the way he'd always been able to talk about those things. Not because they were comfortable, but because they were true, and the truth of them didn't change depending on who was listening. He talked for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 minutes because he'd glanced at the clock when he started and again when he finished, which was a habit from engineering labs where time management was part of the grade. When he stopped, the room was quiet in a different way than before. Diane Wu was leaning slightly forward. She had the look of someone trying to remember if they'd seen this before and concluding they hadn't. "Where did you study?" she asked. "NC State," Mason said. "Mechanical engineering? I didn't finish." "Obviously," Grant said. He said it pleasantly with a small smile, the kind of smile that men like Grant use when they want to demean without appearing to. "I mean, we're grateful for the janitor's perspective, but these are complex systems." "He's right about the mounting brackets," Diane said quietly. Grant turned to look at her. "The East Wing HVAC. He's right. The replacement cost estimates I've been approving for that system have been based on the wrong bracket spec. We've been overspending by approximately 40% for 14 months. She looked at Mason. "How did you calculate the alternative configuration?" Mason thought about it. "I sketched it out on a piece of cardboard in the supply closet, honestly," he said. "I didn't have drafting paper." Nobody laughed, which maybe meant it landed differently than he'd intended. Evelyn was watching him from the far end of the table with an expression he couldn't read. The meeting went on for another hour and a half. By the end of it, 3 of Mason's maintenance proposals had been approved for implementation, 2 more were under active review, and the figure Diane had put on the projected savings, conservative estimate, she'd said, very conservative, was somewhere north of $2 million over the next fiscal year. Grant Mercer left without speaking to anyone. Mason got home at 7:15 that evening, later than usual. Lily was at the kitchen table with her homework spread out around her. She was 8 and deeply serious about 3rd grade in a way that he found both familiar and a little heartbreaking. And his mother-in-law, Ruth, was at the stove making something that smelled like the chicken soup she'd been making the same way for 40 years. "You're late," Ruth said without turning around. "Long day." "There's soup." He sat down across from Lily, who looked up from her worksheet and assessed him the way children sometimes do, not asking anything directly, just measuring. "You look weird," she said. "Weird how?" She considered. "Tired, but like something happened." He looked at his daughter, her mother's eyes, his mother's stubborn chin, and some combination of the two of them in the set of her mouth when she was concentrating, and thought about $2 million and a room full of people who'd looked at him like he didn't belong there, and the woman in the wheelchair who'd looked at him like something else entirely, like he was a fact she was trying to understand. "Something happened," he said. "I'll tell you about it when I figure out how to explain it." Lily thought about that, decided it was acceptable, and went back to her worksheet. Mason ate his soup. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the street was quiet and ordinary in the way that streets become after weather passes through. He thought about the maintenance report he'd folded in his pocket that morning, the one about the drainage system. He thought about the 37 seconds it had taken him to run from the mop cart to the edge of that dock, and how it hadn't felt like running towards something so much as running away from the thought of what would happen if he didn't. He thought about Evelyn Ashford's hands on the armrests of her chair when he pulled it back from the edge. They hadn't been shaking, or if they had been, she'd already made them stop. He went to bed early and lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the city settle before sleep finally came. The approval memo landed in Phil Garrett's inbox on a Wednesday morning, and Phil called Mason into the supply room before lunch. Phil was a decent man in the specific way that people are decent when decency costs them nothing. He'd always been fair to Mason, had signed off on his time cards without complaint, had looked the other way on the 2 occasions Mason had shown up 7 minutes late after Lily's school had a schedule change. But standing in that supply room with the memo in his hand, Phil had the expression of someone who'd been handed something he didn't know how to hold. "This says you're being reassigned," Phil said, "to the East Wing Modernization Project as a," he looked at the paper again, "infrastructure consultant." "I know," Mason said. "You knew before I did?" "Ms. Ashford sent me a message last night." Phil set the memo down on a shelf between a box of industrial trash bags and a bottle of floor cleaner. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, I'm not saying you don't deserve it. What you laid out in that meeting, Diane Wu's been talking about it all week, but Mason, these people up there," he stopped, tried again. "It's not the same as down here." "I know that too." Phil looked at him for a long moment. "You still going to finish that degree?" "That's the plan." "When do you sleep?" It was the most personal thing Phil had ever asked him, and Mason answered it honestly. "Not enough." Phil nodded, picked up the memo, and walked out. That was the end of the conversation, and also in a way the end of one chapter of Mason's time at Ashford Industries. Though he wouldn't understand that until later, when he looked back and could see the shape of things that had been invisible to him while he was living inside them. The offices on the 8th floor were a different country. Mason had been in them before, had mopped those hallways at 4:30 in the morning when everyone else was gone, had emptied the trash cans in the glass-walled conference rooms, and noticed the whiteboards full of numbers and org charts that people had forgotten to erase. He knew what the carpet felt like, and what the air smelled like, and where the vending machine was tucked at the end of the east corridor. But knowing a place at 4 in the morning is not the same as belonging to it at 9, and he felt the difference the first day he showed up in his street clothes. A gray button-down he'd ironed the night before, dark pants, the same boots he wore for everything because he only owned 2 pairs of shoes, and the other ones were for Lily's school events. The project office was a converted conference room. 3 long tables, 2 whiteboards, a wall-mounted screen, and a smell of fresh coffee that someone was always responsible for and no one ever acknowledged. There were 5 other people on the core team. A structural engineer named Bev Chen, who wore the same style of reading glasses in 3 different colors and switched between them depending on what she was doing. A project coordinator named Theo Walsh, who moved through the world at approximately 1 speed regardless of circumstances. A young facilities analyst named Priya, who had been hired 8 months ago and still had the slightly bewildered look of someone who'd expected the job to be different. And 2 contract engineers whose names Mason kept getting right on the second try rather than the first, which bothered him. They were professional with him, careful. Not warm, but not openly hostile either. That was how he read it. Though he understood he might be wrong, that he might be compensating for his own discomfort by categorizing theirs as neutrality when it was something else. The exception was Bev, who on his first morning had pushed a printed copy of the East Wing schematics across the table to him and said, without preamble, "Tell me what you see." He'd told her. She'd listened for 12 minutes straight, which was longer than most people listen to anything, and then she'd said, "You should have finished that degree." "Yeah," he said. "I know. Are you going to?" "Working on it." She'd nodded once, the way people nod when they file something away rather than respond to it, and they'd gotten to work. The rumors started the second week. Mason heard about them the way he heard about most things, indirectly, in pieces, assembling the whole picture from fragments. Priya mentioned something about people talking, in a voice that tried to be casual and wasn't. Theo gave him a look one afternoon that carried weight he couldn't unpack. And then one morning he arrived early, and the 2 contract engineers were in the middle of a conversation that stopped with a specific kind of abruptness when he walked in, the kind that meant the conversation had been about him. He made coffee. He sat down. He opened the schematics on the East Wing electrical grid on and went to work. And he did not ask anyone what was being said because he didn't need to know the specific words to know the shape of the thing. It was Grant Mercer. He'd figured that out within days, not from evidence but from pattern recognition, the way certain executives had begun looking through him in hallways where they'd previously at least looked at him, the way a routine budget request for the modernization project had been kicked back to him 3 times with escalating technical objections that weren't really technical objections, and the way Grant's name kept turning up, quietly, at the edge of things, like a shadow that didn't match its object. The rumors were about him and Evelyn. He understood that without being told directly. He sat with that for a few days before he decided how he felt about it, and what he concluded was that he felt something closer to tired than angry. Tired in the deep way that has nothing to do with sleep, the kind you accumulate from spending years learning that people will build stories about you based on what's convenient for them rather than what's true. He'd learned that after Caroline died, when the looks he got from certain neighbors shifted from sympathy to something more complicated, like they were trying to figure out what a widowed father with a 3-year-old really did with himself. He'd learned it again at Ashford Industries in his first year, when he understood that invisible meant safe, and visible meant becoming something for other people to use. He was visible now, and the story being built about him was the one that was easiest to build. The janitor who'd gotten close to the CEO, the implication hanging in the air like smoke. What he knew, and what the rumors didn't have access to, was this. Evelyn Ashford was the least romantic person he'd ever encountered. This was not a criticism. It was almost a relief. She had a kind of focused severity that left no room for the social performances most powerful people used to make themselves more palatable. She didn't flatter, didn't smooth, didn't soften things to make them easier to receive. When she walked into the project office for a progress review, she had the schematic in her hands before she'd finished saying hello. Their actual dynamic, the real texture of it, was harder to explain and much less interesting as gossip. She asked him questions and listened to the full answer, which was rarer than it should have been. She pushed back when she disagreed, cleanly and without apparent ego about it. Once, early on, she'd pointed out a load calculation he'd gotten wrong, and she'd been right, and he'd said so. And she'd moved on immediately without savoring it the way people sometimes do when they catch someone in a mistake. He respected that. He respected her, genuinely and without performance, which he suspected she could tell. What he didn't know, couldn't know yet, was how much that straightforward respect unsettled her, or why. Evelyn had a ritual that no one at the company knew about. Every Thursday evening, after the last meeting and before the car came to take her home, she sat alone in her office with the lights down and worked on whatever problem was giving her the most trouble that week. Not on the computer, not with notes, just in her head, in the quiet, the way she'd done since she was a graduate student who couldn't afford silence anywhere except inside herself. The Thursday, 3 weeks after Mason's reassignment, the problem she was working on wasn't the East Wing project. It was something Priya had said to her, almost in passing, during a routine check-in. Priya had been describing the team dynamic, carefully, in the way that junior employees describe things when they're not sure how much trouble the truth will cost them, and had mentioned that some people have been saying things about Mr. Calloway and you, and he knows. How does he seem? Evelyn had asked. Priya had thought about it. Quiet, focused. He doesn't seem angry. Evelyn had nodded and moved the conversation forward, and now she was sitting in the dark thinking about what it meant to be the kind of person who responded to being publicly slandered by showing up and doing better work. She'd spent most of her adult life building armor. She understood armor, its usefulness, its costs, the way you could wear it long enough that you forgot what it felt like to not be wearing it. After the accident, after the surgeries, after the specific long education of learning what the world looked like from a wheelchair, she had assembled a self that was capable and controlled and always prepared for what came next. It wasn't happiness exactly, it was competence, which she had found to be more reliable. Mason Calloway didn't seem to be wearing any armor. That was what unsettled her. He was just present, direct. The same man she'd glimpsed on the loading dock who had dived toward danger and then immediately turned to practicalities was the same man who showed up to work in an ironed shirt and clean boots, and talked about electrical load tolerances like they mattered, which to him they apparently did, genuinely without performance. She'd told herself she'd promoted him because the company needed what he could do. That was true. It was also incomplete, and she knew it. And the incomplete part was the problem she was working on in the dark on that Thursday evening. She wasn't sure what to do with the incomplete part. She'd set it aside, which was what she did with things she wasn't sure about, and she thought it would stay there. It hadn't. The meeting that changed things was supposed to be a routine review. Mason had requested an infrastructure walkthrough with the East Wing team, a physical inspection of the areas that would be affected by Phase 1 of the modernization, which was standard procedure and which Evelyn had approved in writing. He'd organized it for a Tuesday morning, printed copies of the relevant assessments for everyone on the team, and confirmed the time with Bev and Theo and the 2 contract engineers. He had not expected Grant Mercer to be there. Grant was standing in the East Wing corridor when they arrived. Standing, not waiting, which was a distinction Mason registered without being entirely sure why. He was dressed the same way he was always dressed, which was like he'd been born wearing a suit, and he had 2 people with him that Mason didn't recognize, both carrying tablets. Mercer, Bev said, which was how she greeted most people. Bev. Grant's eyes moved to Mason. Calloway. Mr. Mercer, Mason said, we didn't have you on the walkthrough schedule. I wanted to see how things were progressing, Grant said easily, given the scope of the investment. There was nothing wrong with that sentence on its face, which was how Grant Mercer usually worked. Every piece of it was reasonable. The totality of it was something else, something Mason had learned to read in rooms where power was distributed unevenly, and some of the people in the room wanted you to know it. They did the walkthrough. Mason ran it. He had the assessment documents and the engineering knowledge and the specific understanding of these systems that nobody else on the team had yet. And he knew the material well enough that he could present and walk and answer questions simultaneously. He'd been doing more public speaking over the past 3 weeks than he'd done in the previous decade, and he was not good at it in the way that people who'd trained for it were good at it, but he was clear and accurate and didn't waste time, which turned out to be sufficient. Grant asked questions. Several of them were genuinely technical questions, which surprised Mason. He'd underestimated the man's knowledge, which was his own error to account for. But interspersed between those questions were others that were something different. Questions about timeline, about budget authority, about procurement decisions that Mason had made in the previous 2 weeks. The bracket supplier you've engaged, Grant said, in the main corridor of the East Wing, with the team standing around them and the lights humming overhead. That's not a vendor on our approved list. The approved list hadn't been updated since 2019, Mason said. The supplier I'm using saves us about 31% on per unit cost and has a faster lead time. I submitted the vendor approval request 10 days ago. I haven't approved it. No, but the request went to facilities procurement. It's in the standard queue. Grant looked at him for a moment. One of the people with tablets was writing something. Budget decisions of that scope require COO sign-off, Grant said. I would have expected someone in your position to know that. The sentence carried a weight that had nothing to do with budget procedures, and everyone in the corridor understood what it was carrying. Mason felt Bev go very still beside him. I'll get you the documentation for the sign-off, Mason said. His voice came out even, which cost him something. Today, if that works. That would be ideal, Grant said, with a small, pleasant smile. We want to make sure the project stays on track. He left before the walkthrough was finished. The team watched him go, and then looked at Mason. And Mason looked at the section of ductwork above them that he'd been assessing when the conversation happened and said, the insulation on this run is original. We're going to need to reprice the replacement cost on the north corridor. Theo, you want to note that? Theo wrote it down. They finished the walkthrough. It took another hour and a half, and Mason did not mention Grant Mercer for the remainder of it, and neither did anyone else, though the shape of what had happened sat in the room with them the whole time like something nobody wanted to step on. That evening, he called Ruth and asked if she could stay with Lily, and then he sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything he could remember about the walkthrough, in order, with timestamps based on when they'd moved between corridor sections. He wrote down Grant's questions verbatim, as best he could recall them. He wrote down the remark about COO sign-off and the part about vendor approval. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with it. He just knew that documentation was the difference between something that happened and something you could prove happened, And that was a lesson he'd learned from 11 years of maintenance reports that nobody read. He made himself a sandwich and ate it standing at the counter, looked at his own reflection in the dark kitchen window. His hair needed cutting. He had a structural dynamics exam in 9 days for the course he was taking online through the community college as a bridge toward re-enrollment at NC State. The exam covered resonance frequency and harmonic load distribution, which he'd been studying in the half hour before bed every night for 2 weeks, reading on his phone after the apartment went quiet. 1 semester. That was all that stood between him and the degree he'd been 4 courses from completing 11 years ago. 1 semester, and it had started feeling less theoretical recently, less like an idea he was keeping warm, and more like something with an actual shape, an actual endpoint. He was going to finish it. He hadn't said that to anyone out loud yet, not even Lily, but he knew it the way he knew structural things, from the inside, from the load-bearing logic of it. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. The message was from Evelyn's direct line, which he had in his contacts because she'd insisted the project team have it. It was short. I heard about today. Come see me tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. He typed back, I'll be there. Then he finished his sandwich, washed the plate, and went to check on Lily. She was asleep with her reading light on and a library book spread open on her chest, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her. Her small, serious face in repose, the specific way her hair fanned out against the pillow, and thought about what Phil Garrett had asked him in the supply room. When do you sleep? He turned off her reading light, pulled the blanket up, went to bed. Evelyn's office in the morning was different than the company's other spaces. It was less performative, for one thing, less interested in communicating power through furniture. There was a large desk, but it was a working desk, covered in papers and 2 monitors, and 3 coffee cups in various states of fullness. The shelves held actual books, some of them with cracked spines, and a row of framed photographs that he didn't examine closely, but registered as personal rather than ceremonial. She was already at her desk when he came in. She was reading something and finished the paragraph before she looked up, which he would have found rude from most people, but from her read as a different kind of respect. The kind that says, I'm not pretending I wasn't in the middle of something. Sit down, she said. He sat. Tell me what happened yesterday. He told her, all of it, in order, without editorializing, the same way he'd written it on the legal pad the night before. She listened without interrupting, which was characteristic, and when he finished, she sat back and looked at the window for a moment. The vendor approval, she said. Is the documentation in order? Yes. Send it to me directly. I'll handle the sign-off. That might make things more complicated. She looked at him. Complicated how? He considered how to say it. If it looks like you're intervening on my behalf every time Mercer pushes back, it feeds a narrative that's already out there. The one about us. He kept his voice neutral. I'm not suggesting we ignore it. I'm suggesting the cleanest response is probably for me to work through standard channels where possible and document everything where it's not. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. He couldn't tell if she was considering what he'd said or preparing to override it. That approach requires you to absorb a certain amount of obstruction in the short term, she said finally. I've been absorbing it, he said. I'm saying I'd rather absorb it with paper trails than get insulated from it in ways that cost you politically. She studied him. There was something in her expression he couldn't name. Not surprise exactly, but a version of the look she'd had on the loading dock when she'd turned the chair and found him standing there, like she was recalibrating something she'd already thought she understood. You think about my position a lot, she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It's relevant to the project, he said. If you're exposed, the project's exposed. And if I told you that's not a typical concern for someone in your position? I'm not typical, he said, without inflation, just as a statement of fact. You know that. That's why I'm here. It was the most direct thing he'd said to her that had nothing to do with engineering, and he watched her take it in, not flinch from it exactly, but register it. Something adjusted in the room. The vendor approval goes to procurement, she said. Standard channel. I'll make sure it doesn't sit. Thank you. The project timeline, she said, shifting. You said Tuesday you thought Phase 1 could complete 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Possibly 3, if the bracket delivery doesn't get held up. It won't. He looked at her. Not because I'm intervening, she said, because I'm going to approve the vendor request today and that clears the queue. That's the standard channel, he said. Yes, she said, it is. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across her face, brief and unannounced, and was gone before he could be sure it had been there. He stood to go. Mason, she said when he was at the door. He turned. The rumors, she said. She was looking at him directly with the same focused honesty that characterized everything about her. I know you know. I want you to know that I'm aware of them and I take them seriously in the sense that I think they're deliberate and I think I know where they're coming from. Yeah, he said. Me too. They don't change anything, she said. No, he agreed. They don't. He left. In the elevator on his way back down to the 8th floor, he leaned against the back wall and looked at the ceiling and thought about Lily's school play in 2 weeks, which she'd reminded him about 3 times, and the structural dynamics exam, and the East Wing HVAC Phase 1 schedule, and the specific way Evelyn Ashford had said it doesn't change anything, like she was making a promise to herself as much as to him, and wasn't entirely sure yet if she could keep it. The elevator opened on 8. He went to work. Grant Mercer did not let up. That was the thing Mason had to recalibrate for, because he'd handled obstruction before. Had spent 3 years watching maintenance reports disappear into a bureaucratic void. But this was different in texture. This was active. It had intention behind it. The vendor approval cleared, as Evelyn had said it would. But 2 days later, a routine permit for the East Wing structural work was flagged by the city inspector's office for a secondary review. A review that Theo, who had been doing project coordination for 9 years, said he'd never seen triggered for a project of this scope before. The day after that, a memo went around the executive floor reminding all department heads of the protocol for approving contractors, written in bland procedural language, copied to Mason, with Grant's name in the sender field. Mason read the memo, noted it, and filed it in the folder he was keeping. Then he submitted a formal request to the city inspector's office explaining the basis for the secondary review inquiry, attached the engineering documentation supporting the permit application, and copied it to Diane Wu in Facilities Engineering and the city's project liaison. The secondary review was resolved in 4 business days. The permit cleared. He didn't tell Evelyn about the permit issue. She would have found out eventually, but in the meantime the project moved forward, and Bev said to him on a Friday afternoon, while they were both looking at a revised timeline she'd printed out, "You know he's not going to stop." "I know," Mason said. "Some people," Bev said in a tone that suggested she was not one for speeches, but occasionally made exceptions, "would use this as a reason to scale back. Don't make waves. Let Mercer feel like he's won something small so he leaves the bigger stuff alone." "Is that what you do?" Bev considered. She switched her reading glasses from blue to green, which was apparently her serious color. "No," she said. "But I'm also not a single father trying to hold down a project I wasn't supposed to be on in the first place." He looked at her. "You know about Lily?" "Priya mentioned it. Don't be mad at her. She wasn't gossiping. She was trying to explain to the contract guys why you were always the first one in and the last one out." He thought about that. "What did they say?" One of them said, "Huh." The other one said, "Makes sense." Bev folded the timeline printout in thirds. "You should take that as a win." It was, he supposed, a version of one. That evening, driving home in his 8-year-old truck with the defroster that worked on the passenger side, but not his, a fact of his life for so long that he'd stopped registering it most mornings, he ran through the Phase 1 numbers in his head and thought about Bev's question and what the true answer was. Not what he'd said, which was honest as far as it went, but the layer underneath it that he didn't usually put into words. The true answer was that he had spent too long being invisible to spend any more time choosing it. He had written 19 maintenance reports. He had watched 14 of them disappear. He had gone to work every night in a building he understood better than most of the people who ran it. And he had come home and studied textbook chapters and helped with multiplication worksheets and made soup and fallen asleep in the chair, reading, and woken up stiff-necked at 2 a.m., and gone to bed and done it again. He was not angry about any of it. What he felt was something harder to name, a kind of low, steady resolve, the kind that doesn't make noise. He was going to do this job the right way. He was going to finish his degree. He was going to be home for Lily's school play. The rest of it, Grant Mercer, the rumors, the meetings where he could feel people deciding who he was before he opened his mouth, was noise. He knew how to work through noise. He'd been doing it for 11 years. The accident happened on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks into Phase 1. Mason was on the 4th floor of the East Wing when his phone rang. Not a call, which would have been bad enough, but Theo's voice coming through the site radio they'd set up for the construction crews, tight and clipped in a way Theo never sounded, because Theo was constitutionally incapable of urgency. And the fact that he sounded urgent now meant something had gone wrong in a way that urgency was appropriate for. Mason, North Corridor, basement level, now. He was down the stairwell before Theo finished the sentence. The basement of the East Wing was the oldest part of the building. Original construction from the mid-70s, low ceilings, concrete block walls that sweated in winter, a network of overhead conduit and support framing that Mason had flagged in his very first assessment as the section requiring the most careful sequencing. The work down there was supposed to be methodical. Measured loads, staged removal, never taking down more than the calculation said was safe to take down in any given session. He smelled it before he saw it. The specific metallic dust of disturbed concrete, the sharper edge of something that had come apart under stress. Then he rounded the corner and saw the section of overhead support framing that had failed, and beneath it, 3 of his crew members standing in a loose cluster around a 4th, who was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his left arm held against his chest, at an angle that Mason's body understood as wrong, before his brain finished processing what his eyes were seeing. The man on the floor was Marcus Webb. He was 31 years old, had a wife named Denise, and a son who had just started walking, and he had been on Mason's crew since week 2 of the project, because Mason had specifically requested him after seeing how carefully Marcus worked around load-bearing elements. He was not crying, which said something about Marcus Webb as a person, but his face was the color of old ash, and his breathing was careful in the way that means breathing is something that currently hurts. "Marcus," Mason said, crouching down. "I'm okay," Marcus said immediately, which was what people said when they were not okay and knew it and were trying to give everyone around them something manageable to work with. "Don't move the arm." Mason looked at the other 3 crew members. Danny had already called emergency services. Mason could hear him on his phone in the background. He looked at Theo, who had appeared behind him at some point. "What happened?" "The support joint," Theo said. "The one on the north corner of that run." He pointed at the fallen section. "It came apart when Marcus was directly under it." Mason looked at the failed joint. It was maybe 15 feet away, the metal components scattered across the concrete floor. He looked at it for 3 seconds, noting what he could from that distance, and then he looked back at Marcus and stayed with Marcus until the paramedics arrived, because that was what needed to happen in the right order. The paramedics took Marcus out on a stretcher. Possible fracture, they said, maybe 2. They would know more at the hospital. Mason watched the stretcher go and felt something cold and specific settle in the middle of his chest. He called Denise Webb himself before he did anything else. He stood in the East Wing basement with the fallen support framing on the floor behind him, and he told her what had happened and what he knew and what he didn't know and what hospital they were taking Marcus to. And he kept his voice steady because she needed steady and because it was the only useful thing he could give her in that moment. She cried a little, quietly, and then said she was going now, and he said okay, and the call ended. He stood there for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he looked at the failed joint. The support framing in the East Wing basement had been inspected 14 days earlier by a contracted structural inspector whose name was on the certification documents in Mason's project binder. It had passed. The inspection report was 4 pages long, and Mason had read all 4 pages, and the north corner joint had been rated as compliant with the load requirements for the work being done. Mason spent 2 hours in that basement that morning, and he did not touch the failed components. He photographed everything from multiple angles, from multiple distances, made notes on his legal pad, and then sat on a piece of equipment casing and looked at the joint mechanism from 8 feet away for a long time without doing anything else. The failure pattern was wrong. That was the thing. He wasn't a materials failure specialist. He had the engineering fundamentals, and he had 11 years of looking at how things were put together in this specific building, But he was not the right person to make a definitive call on what had happened to that joint. What he could say, with the confidence of someone who has spent a substantial portion of his adult life looking at how metal behaves under stress, was that the failure pattern he was looking at was not consistent with what he would expect from a joint under the rated load it had been carrying. He photographed everything twice. He called the structural inspector and left a message. He filed an incident report with the city's construction safety office, which was legally required and which he did within the hour. He called Bev and asked her to meet him at the site, and when she got there, he showed her the joint without telling her what he thought, and watched her look at it. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "When was this last inspected?" 2 weeks ago. Past. She looked at him. "That's not a fatigue failure." "No," he said. "It isn't." She looked at the joint again. "You need someone who can test the material composition." "I know. I've already called a materials lab." Bev nodded slowly. She put her blue glasses back on. She'd had the green ones on when she arrived, and she switched them while she was looking at the joint, which Mason was learning meant she was moving from active processing into something more careful. "You're going to need to document everything you do from this point forward," she said. "Already am." Mason. She said his name the way she said things when she wanted to make sure he was actually listening rather than just hearing. "If this is what it looks like." "I know," he said. "Do you want me to call Evelyn?" He thought about it. "Not yet. Not until I have something more than a pattern that looks wrong." She accepted that. It was one of the things he'd come to value about Bev. She knew when the right move was to trust someone's judgment and get out of the way. The project was paused on the basement level pending the safety review. The rest of the phases continued. Mason ran the upper floors during the day and spent his evenings going back through every inspection record, every materials order, every delivery log from the beginning of the project. He was looking for something. He didn't know exactly what shape it would be when he found it. Marcus Webb had 2 fractures in his left arm, the radius and a hairline in the ulna, and a bruised set of ribs on the left side. He would need surgery for the radius. He would be out of work for 8 weeks minimum, and his recovery after that depended on how the surgery went and what the physical therapist said. Mason visited the hospital on Friday evening. He brought food from the Vietnamese place near his apartment. He didn't know what Marcus liked and had guessed based on a conversation they'd had once about a restaurant near the site, and sat in the room for an hour while Denise ate something for the first time since the day before, and Marcus was awake and less gray-faced than he'd been on the basement floor. "You don't need to be here," Marcus said at one point. Not ungrateful, just factual, the way Marcus was about most things. "I know," Mason said. "Then why are you?" Mason thought about it. "Because I told you the site was safe," he said. "I'm responsible for that." Marcus looked at him for a moment with the direct, evaluating look of someone who has recently had cause to think about what matters. "The joint that failed," he said. "I've been thinking about it. Don't worry about that right now. I'm lying in a hospital bed. I've got nothing but time to worry about it." He shifted carefully, protecting the ribs. "That joint was solid 2 days ago. I checked it myself. Not because anyone asked me to. I just always check the overheads when I'm working underneath them. And it was solid." Mason didn't say anything for a moment. "You're sure?" "I put my hand on it. I know what solid feels like." Marcus looked at the ceiling. Something changed. Mason drove home from the hospital in the dark, with the heat in the truck running at full, because the temperature had dropped, and his defroster was still dead on the driver's side, and he needed to think. He thought about the joint. He thought about what Marcus had just said. He thought about the inspection report and the failure pattern, and the question of what could change a solid joint into a failed one in 48 hours without the standard indicators of fatigue or overload. He thought about Grant Mercer. He pulled over on a side street 3 blocks from his apartment and sat with the engine running for about 5 minutes, doing nothing except being careful with himself, making sure he was thinking and not reacting, because there was a significant difference between those 2 things, and the difference mattered enormously when you were about to start looking for evidence of something that, if you were wrong about it, would end everything. He wasn't wrong. He knew it the way he knew structural things, from the inside. But knowing something and being able to prove it were different problems. And the second one was the one he needed to solve. He pulled back into traffic and drove home. But The materials lab report came back 9 days after the incident. Mason read it at the kitchen table at 6:30 in the morning, while Lily was still asleep and Ruth hadn't arrived yet, and the apartment was quiet, in the particular way it was quiet before the day started. A held breath kind of quiet, everything still in potential. The report was 11 pages. The relevant section was on page 7. The joint's fastener assembly showed evidence of chemical exposure inconsistent with the ambient environment of the basement workspace. The specific compound identified was a corrosive agent. The report named it, a technical designation that Mason looked up to be sure he understood it correctly. That accelerated metal fatigue in high-carbon steel alloys in a way that was not immediately visible, but that would, under standard construction loads, produce failure within 72 to 96 hours of application. He read that section 3 times. Then he sat back and looked at the window, where the morning was gray and flat, and a pigeon was doing something pointless on the fire escape railing, and he stayed very still for a long time. Someone had put a corrosive compound on that fastener assembly. Not an accident, not environmental drift, not a material defect. Someone had done it deliberately, with the knowledge of what it would do and approximately when, and they had done it in the 2-day window between Marcus's check and the morning of the failure. Marcus Webb's broken arm, his fractured ribs, his wife sitting in a hospital waiting room at 8 in the morning with nothing to eat. Mason closed the report, opened it again, looked at the date stamp on the lab analysis, the signature of the certifying engineer, the chain of custody documentation that the lab had attached because Mason had specifically requested it when he submitted the samples, because he'd had a feeling. He'd had a feeling and he'd been right, and he wished profoundly that he hadn't been. He called Bev at 7:15. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she was already awake, which meant she'd been waiting. "The lab report came," she said. "Yeah." A silence. "Tell me." He told her. He read the relevant section aloud, slowly, while she listened without speaking. When he finished, there was a longer silence. "Mason," Bev said, "this is criminal." "I know." "This is not a company HR matter. This is not a board of directors matter. This is—" "I know," he said again. "I know what this is." Another silence. Then, "What are you going to do?" He'd been working on that since 6:30. "There's security footage in the basement level," he said. "I need to request it before it gets overwritten. The system cycles every 30 days, which means the window from before the incident is still there. But I need to request it through the right channel so it can't be challenged later." "That's facilities records. Phil Garrett." "Yeah," he paused. "I need to go through Phil, not Evelyn." He could hear Bev understanding why. If the footage request came through the CEO's office, it could be framed as executive overreach, as a politically motivated investigation. It needed to come from a project team records request, standard incident documentation protocol. Boring and procedural and unassailable. "Phil will ask why," Bev said. "I'll tell him it's part of the incident investigation," which is true. "And then?" "Then I look at what's on it," Mason said, "and then we figure out what comes next." Phil Garrett processed the footage request the same day, which Mason appreciated in a way he didn't articulate. Phil had looked at him across the facility's office desk with an expression that carried a complicated mixture of things: concern and something older than concern, something that looked like he was doing arithmetic, and had said, "This is for the incident report." "Yes," Mason said. Phil had looked at him for another moment. "You need it unedited?" "I need the full authenticated copy with the timestamp metadata intact." Phil had nodded, slowly, and submitted the request to building security, and that was that. The footage came in 2 days later on a secure drive. Mason watched it in the project office on a Saturday morning when the building was empty, with Bev sitting beside him because he'd asked her to be there, and because she was the kind of person who showed up when you asked. The basement-level camera covered the north corridor. The timestamp range Mason was looking at was the 48-hour window before the incident, the period between Marcus's manual check and Thursday morning. Most of it was empty corridor. Overnight, the building was quiet, and the basement was quieter than most. Mason moved through the footage at 2 times speed, watching the counter in the corner until he saw movement. He stopped, went back, played it at normal speed. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m., 2 nights before the accident. A figure in the basement corridor, moving with the specific unhurried pace of someone who is not supposed to be there and knows it and has decided that confidence is the best camouflage. The person was wearing a jacket with the collar up and a hat pulled down, which was not nothing. It suggested awareness of the camera. But the camera angle was from above and slightly behind the position of the north corner joint. And when the figure stopped at the joint and reached up and worked at it for about 90 seconds with something small that Mason couldn't fully identify from this angle, it caught the profile. Just the profile. Just enough. Bev leaned forward. She didn't say anything. Mason paused the frame. The profile was partial, jaw and cheekbone, the specific set of the shoulders. He looked at it for a long time. "Do you recognize that?" Bev said quietly. "I need to see it on a bigger screen," he said, "and I need someone who can do a proper image analysis on the metadata." They watched the rest of the relevant window. The figure left. Nobody else came into the corridor for the rest of the night. The next morning, the crew arrived and the work began. And at 9:14 a.m., the north corner joint gave way, and Marcus Webb was on the floor with his arm against his chest. Mason saved the footage timestamps on his legal pad. He wrote down the precise frame numbers and the timestamp metadata identifiers. He put the secure drive in the inner pocket of his jacket, and he put his hand over his jacket for a moment, just pressing it flat against his chest, not because it was a dramatic gesture, but because he needed to feel that it was there. "Okay," he said. "What now?" Bev asked. "Now I call my cousin," Mason said. "He does forensic image work. And then I call a lawyer." Bev looked at him. "A lawyer? A real one, not the company's." She thought about that. "That's going to cost you." Yeah," he said. "I know." He took out his phone, dialed his cousin first, got voicemail, left a message. Then he sat for a moment looking at the paused frame on the screen, the partial profile, the raised arm, the 90 seconds that had broken a man's bones. And he thought about what it must feel like to make a decision like that. To stand in a basement at midnight and damage a structural component and walk away knowing what it would do to whoever happened to be under it when it went. He didn't spend long on that. Spending time trying to understand that kind of thinking wasn't productive, and he'd learned years ago to be honest with himself about the difference between what was productive and what just felt necessary because it was painful. He called the lawyer. Her name was Adrienne Park. She was a former state prosecutor who now ran a small civil and criminal practice out of an office above a dry cleaner on the east side of the city, and Mason had found her through the legal aid network he'd looked up on his phone at 11 p.m. 3 nights earlier while Lily was asleep. And he was sitting in the kitchen going through everything he knew. He'd called her at 8 the next morning and she'd picked up herself, which he took as a good sign. He met her on a Monday afternoon. Her office was small and direct. Like she was, no art on the walls, a cluttered desk, a window that looked out at the street below where ordinary things were happening. She listened to him for 40 minutes without writing anything down, and at the end she said, "You have the lab report, the footage, and the incident report filed with the city." "Yes." "And you've kept the footage drive in your personal possession since receiving it?" "Yes." "You didn't tell the CEO?" "Not yet." She thought about that. "Why not?" "Because if this goes wrong," Mason said, "I don't want her fingerprints on it. She's the one who put me in this position. If I go to her first and the evidence doesn't hold up, or if Mercer has anticipated some of this, it looks like I'm using her as cover. I don't want her used." Adrienne looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't categorize. "Most people in your situation come to me looking for the fastest path to making themselves whole," she said. "You're telling me you've been strategizing about how to protect someone else." "It's not strategic," he said. "It's just how it is." She nodded once, a short, decisive nod that he would learn was her version of accepting something and moving on. "Okay, here's what I need you to do." She walked him through it. The forensic image analysis needed to be completed by a certified third-party lab, not his cousin. His cousin could do a preliminary identification, but it needed to be certified to be usable. The materials lab report needed to go to the city's construction safety office with a formal supplement identifying it as a potential criminal matter, not just a safety violation. She would contact the city attorney's office to loop in the appropriate channels. He should not speak to Grant Mercer or anyone in his orbit. He should document every interaction with anyone connected to the project, dated and time-stamped. And the board meeting, she said. What about it? There's a quarterly board meeting in 3 weeks. Evelyn Ashford chairs it. I need you to think about whether there's a reason to bring this to the board before the meeting or during it. He thought about it. During, he said. If Mercer knows in advance that this is coming, he has time to get in front of it. The board meeting is the one situation where he can't control who's in the room. Adrienne considered him for a moment. You've thought about this. I've had nothing but time to think about it, he said. I've got a kid to pick up from school and an exam in 4 days, but in between those things, yes, I've thought about it. She almost smiled. The exam. Engineering? Structural dynamics. She made a small sound that might have been appreciation. Pass it, she said. Then let's go to work. The exam was on a Thursday. He sat at the kitchen table with Lily asleep in the next room and took it on his laptop from 8 p.m. to 10:30. And when it was done, he sat back and stared at the ceiling and felt the specific hollow exhaustion of having held 2 completely different and equally important things in his head at the same time for 4 hours. He didn't know his grade yet. He thought he'd done well on the resonance frequency section, and less well on one of the harmonic loading problems where he'd second-guessed himself midway through, and he still wasn't sure he'd been right to change his answer. It would be what it would be. He went to bed. He slept 6 hours, which was more than he usually got. He woke up at 5 to the sound of his phone buzzing. It was his cousin calling back finally, and they talked for 20 minutes about the footage. His cousin confirmed he could do a preliminary analysis and get Mason something usable within a week. And Mason gave him the forensic lab's contact information so they could coordinate the certified process in parallel. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the early morning quiet, thought about Marcus Webb in his hospital bed with his arm in a surgical brace and his wife sitting beside him, and about the East Wing basement, and about the folder on his desk that held everything, the lab report, the footage documentation, the incident report, the legal pad with its dated entries, the conversation notes, all of it. Lily came out at 7, still in her pajamas, hair going in 3 different directions, carrying the book she'd been reading the night before, as though she'd only set it down for sleep and was picking up immediately where she'd left off. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." She sat across from him, opened her book, then looked over the top of it. "Are you worried about something?" He thought about how to answer. He'd never lied to Lily. Not really. Had withheld things, framed things carefully, chosen the version of truth that was age-appropriate. But she was 8, and she was also observant in the way that children become observant when they've grown up in a house where one person has to carry everything, where they learn to read the room because the room matters. "A little," he said, "nothing that isn't manageable." She accepted that, the way she accepted most things, not entirely, but provisionally, reserving the right to revisit. She went back to her book. He drank his coffee. "You remember you have my play," she said, without looking up. 3 weeks from Saturday." "I remember." "You wrote it down?" "On the refrigerator." She checked. He had. She seemed satisfied. "It's the 3rd scene that matters most," she told him. "The first 2 are fine, but the 3rd one is the one where I have the most lines." "I'll pay extra attention to the 3rd scene," he said. She nodded, considered this sufficient, and read her book while Mason sat across from her and finished his coffee and thought about the board meeting and the footage and the certified lab analysis and the quiet, careful work of building something solid enough that when it came down to it, nothing would be able to knock it over. The forensic image analysis came back in 11 days. Mason opened the email at his desk in the project office, alone, after Bev and Theo and everyone else had gone for the day. He read the summary first, then the technical appendix, then the summary again. The analysis identified the individual in the basement corridor footage with a confidence level the report described as high probability based on biometric markers, facial geometry, shoulder width, specific postural characteristics. The report attached reference images for comparison. The reference images were drawn from publicly available corporate photography on Ashford Industries' official website. The name in the report was Grant Mercer. Mason sat with that for a moment, Not because it was a surprise, but because there's a difference between suspecting something and having a certified third party put a name and a confidence rating to it. The weight of it was different when it was official. It had a different kind of realness. He emailed Adrian. Then he called Evelyn. She picked up on the second ring. "I need 30 minutes," he said. "Tomorrow morning, early, before anyone else is in." A pause. She knew from his voice he could tell, knew that something had shifted, that this was not a project update call. 7 o'clock, she said. "Yes. I'll be here." He hung up. Sat in the empty project office for a while, in the quiet. Through the window, the city was doing what cities do in the evening. Lights coming on in increments, traffic thinning, the slow replacement of daytime noise with something lower and more ambient. He thought about the board meeting, 2 weeks away. He thought about Adrian's instructions, which he had followed precisely, and about the folder on his desk, which was now thick enough that he'd had to put a second rubber band around it. He thought about a man in a basement at midnight making a decision that broke another man's bones. He thought about Marcus Webb's son, who had just started walking. He put the folder in his bag. He turned off the project office lights. He went home to his daughter. The meeting in Evelyn's office the next morning was not like their previous meetings. He put the folder on her desk. He walked her through it in order. The incident, the materials lab report, the footage, the forensic analysis, Adrian's assessment, the chain of documentation. He talked for 22 minutes. She didn't interrupt once. When he finished, she was very still. She was looking at the forensic analysis summary. Her face was doing something controlled and careful, the same way it had been controlled and careful on the loading dock, but there was something different underneath it. Something that had the quality of a person confronting the full dimensions of a thing they had suspected but hoped was smaller than it turned out to be. "He hurt Marcus to stop the project," she said. Not a question. To discredit it, or to slow it down enough to create grounds for restructuring the leadership? Mason paused. "Possibly both." She looked up. "How long have you had this?" "The analysis came back yesterday. The footage, 11 days. And you didn't come to me." "I needed it to be clean," he said. "If you were in it from the beginning, anything that came out of this could be characterized as—" "I understand." She said it quietly, looking at the documents. "I understand why you did it that way." There was a silence that had texture to it. "The board meeting," she said. 2 weeks. She set the forensic report down. She sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. A rare thing for Evelyn, the ceiling looking. It said something about where she was. "He's been on this board for 9 years, she said. "He has relationships with 4 of the 7 independent directors." "I know." "This is going to be—" "I know," Mason said. "But it needs to happen at the meeting, where he can't get ahead of it." She looked at him. "My lawyer agrees," he said. "And she's better at this than both of us." Something moved across Evelyn's face. Not quite humor, but something adjacent to it, brief and complicated. "I'd like to meet your lawyer." "She'd like to meet you too." Evelyn looked at the folder. She put her hand on top of it, flat, the same way she pressed her hands to the desk sometimes when she was steadying herself. She kept it there. "Mason," she said. He waited. "What they were saying about us," she said. "The rumors." She didn't look up from the folder. "I've been thinking about what I said to you, that it doesn't change anything." He stayed quiet. "I meant it," she said, "but I want you to know—" She stopped, tried again. "I want you to know that I'm aware of what it cost you, to be seen that way. To have people say those things and not be able to correct them, because correcting them would have made things harder." He thought about how to respond to that. "It costs less than you might think," he said. "I've been invisible for a long time. Being talked about wrong is uncomfortable. Being invisible is worse." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up, and it was the most direct she'd ever looked at him. Not the professional directness, the CEO focus, but something less armored, something that was maybe what she looked like when she wasn't actively managing herself. "You've been carrying a lot of this alone," she said. "I carry most things alone," he said. "I've got a system." "Does the system work?" He thought about Lily at the kitchen table with her book, about Marcus in the hospital, about the exam grade he still hadn't checked. about the folder under Evelyn's hand with everything he'd built in it. "So far," he said. She nodded. The armor was back, but softer at the edges than before, which was something he noticed without knowing what to do with it. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he agreed. He left her office and walked to the elevator and wrote it down to 8, and went to the project office and sat down and opened the East Wing Phase 2 scheduling document, because the project didn't stop and the work was the work. And he told Marcus Webb this site would be safe, and he intended to make sure it was right through to the end, whatever the end turned out to be. He checked his exam grade while the document was loading. He'd passed. He set the phone down and got to work. The 2 weeks before the board meeting were the longest of Mason's professional life. And that included the stretch after Caroline died, when he'd been running on 3 hours of sleep and grief and the specific terror of being solely responsible for a 3-year-old who didn't yet understand why her mother wasn't coming home. He kept working. That was the only strategy available to him, and it was also, he recognized, the only thing that kept the inside of his head from becoming a place he couldn't manage. The East Wing Phase 2 had resumed on the upper floors, while the basement level remained closed pending the safety review. And there was enough legitimate work to fill 12 hours a day if he let it, which he did. Adrienne had been clear with him in their last call before the meeting. Don't do anything that looks like preparation. Don't have unusual conversations with board members. Don't change your schedule. Don't avoid Mercer. Don't seek him out. Be exactly who you've been since the beginning. The best thing the evidence could do was speak without any apparent orchestration around it, which meant Mason's job for 14 days was to be boring and consistent and to let Adrienne handle the parts that required a different skill set. He was good at boring and consistent. He had 11 years of practice. What he wasn't good at, it turned out, was sitting across from Grant Mercer in a project status meeting on a Tuesday afternoon and listening to the man talk about procurement timelines with the particular smoothness of someone who has no reason to think the floor is about to fall out from under him. Mercer sat at the head of the table in that meeting. It was a cross-departmental review that he'd called, technically within his authority as COO, and he spoke with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being the largest presence in any room. And Mason sat 3 seats down and took notes and answered questions directly and gave absolutely nothing away. He got home that evening and stood in the kitchen for 5 minutes doing nothing before Lily appeared and asked what was for dinner, and the question snapped him back into the ordinary machinery of the evening. Food, homework, bath, bedtime story, the dishes afterward, the quiet. He was grateful for the machinery. He'd built it over years, and it held. Adrienne met with Evelyn 4 days before the board meeting in Evelyn's office, and Mason was not present for that meeting because Adrienne had said his presence was unnecessary and possibly counterproductive. He found out how it went from Evelyn, who called him that evening. "She's very direct," Evelyn said. "Yeah," Mason said. "That's why I hired her?" "She told me the evidence package is solid." Her words were a pause, and he could hear Evelyn consulting something. The kind of thing that doesn't leave much room for alternative interpretation. "That's good." "She also told me that Grant may have been building a case of his own, a preemptive narrative." Evelyn's voice was careful, which meant she was choosing words. "About your qualifications. There's a rumor circulating at the board level, Adrienne heard it through a contact, that someone has been suggesting your appointment to the project was irregular, that I bypassed standard process." Mason was quiet for a moment. "Did you?" "No, it was unconventional, but it was within my authority as CEO. The board has always known I have latitude on project leadership appointments." She paused. "But unconventional and irregular are different things, and the way it's being characterized, he's trying to make the whole project look like a personal decision," Mason said, "so that anything that comes out of the project can be attributed to bias on your part." "Yes." He thought about that. "Does Adrienne know?" "She said she'd anticipated it, her word." "Then it's in hand." There was a silence. It was the kind of silence that happens sometimes between them now. Not awkward, but full, like a room with more furniture than it appears to have from the doorway. "Mason," Evelyn said, "if this doesn't go the way we've planned, it will. But if it doesn't—" "Evelyn." He said her name the way he rarely did, without a title, which was something they'd shifted into over the weeks without either of them formally deciding to. "The evidence is what it is. I've done the work. You've made the right calls. Adrienne knows what she's doing. At some point, you have to let go of the part you can't control. A pause. That's not something I'm naturally good at, she said. I know. Me neither. He thought about it. I've just had more practice. She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that was slightly different, lower, less managed, "How's Lily?" He hadn't been expecting that. It wasn't that they didn't talk about non-work things. They did, increasingly, in the margins of conversations that had started as project updates. But the directness of it, the simple human interest of it, caught him somewhere he wasn't fully defended. "She's good," he said. "She's got her school play this week. She's been running her lines at the dinner table every night. She plays a cartographer in something the teacher wrote about exploration." "A cartographer?" "She's very serious about it." "She sounds like you," Evelyn said. He didn't know how to respond to that, so he said, "Get some sleep before the meeting. You're going to need to be sharp." "I'm always sharp." "Sharper than usual, then." She made a small sound that was the closest thing to a laugh he'd heard from her, and the call ended, and he stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand for a moment before putting it down and going to check on Lily. What? The school play was on a Saturday afternoon, 4 days before the board meeting. The auditorium at Lily's elementary school held about 200 people if everyone was friendly about personal space, and on this particular Saturday, it was at approximately 180, which meant Mason was standing against the side wall with a clear sight line to the stage because he'd arrived 12 minutes before the doors opened and reconnoitered for the best angle, which was something he did in buildings out of habit. Ruth was beside him. She had brought a camera she didn't entirely know how to use, her daughter's camera, Caroline's camera, which she'd kept in a drawer for years and taken out for occasions that mattered. She'd asked Mason to show her the zoom function twice in the car on the way over, and he'd shown her both times without commentary, which was how they managed most things. The play was 35 minutes long. Lily appeared in the third scene, as promised, in a costume that consisted of a brown vest, a wide-brimmed hat, and a paper scroll she carried with great seriousness. She had 7 lines. She delivered all 7 of them clearly and without rushing, and with a focus that Mason recognized because he had seen it at the kitchen table over homework worksheets, and at the dinner table over running her lines, and in the back seat of the truck when she was reading. He stood against the wall of that auditorium and watched his daughter stand on a stage and be entirely, unselfconsciously herself, and he felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. Ruth took 12 photographs, 9 of which were slightly blurry because of the zoom function, and afterward, in the parking lot, Lily stood between them and accepted congratulations with the manner of someone who had expected to do well and was pleased to have confirmed it. "You were great, Bug," Mason told her. "I know," she said. Then, because she was 8 and also his daughter. "Were you watching in the third scene specifically?" "The whole time, but especially the third scene." She nodded, took his hand. "Can we get tacos?" "Yeah," he said. "We can get tacos." The night before the board meeting, Mason couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark and ran through the documentation in his head, not because he was worried it wasn't solid, but because running through things was what he did. The same way he walked construction sites before crews arrived, checking load points and potential failure modes. He went through the materials lab report, the footage chain of custody, the forensic analysis certification, Adrienne's legal brief. He went through it all twice, methodically, and found nothing he'd missed because he'd been through it so many times that there was nothing left to find. At 3 in the morning, he got up, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark with his phone. He looked up Marcus Webb's number and then put the phone down without calling because 3 a.m. was not the time. He looked at the certificate on the refrigerator, Lily's perfect attendance award from last semester, which she'd insisted on displaying, and at the note card he'd taped beside it 2 weeks ago with the board meeting date and time. He thought about who he'd been 4 months ago. The mop cart, the carbon copy maintenance reports folded in his breast pocket, the specific invisibility of moving through a building at 4 in the morning, knowing its systems better than anyone, known by essentially no one. He didn't miss it. That was the honest answer when he asked himself. He missed certain things. The uncomplicated quality of work that began and ended within a single shift, the absence of politics, the way the building felt in the small hours when it was just him and the hum of the HVAC and the work in front of him. But the invisibility itself, the sense of being present but uncounted, no. He didn't miss that. He thought about Caroline. He did this less than he used to, which he decided was probably healthy rather than a failing, though he'd never been certain. He thought about what she would have made of all this. The board meeting, the project, Evelyn Ashford, the folder full of evidence, the engineering degree he was 3 courses from finishing. She had been a person of strong opinions and no patience for theater, which he suspected she would have applied with some enthusiasm to Grant Mercer. She would have told him to go to bed. She would have been right. He went back to bed. He didn't sleep much, but he lay there with his eyes closed and let his body rest even if his mind wouldn't, which was a skill he'd developed during the years when sleep had been a theoretical concept rather than a daily reality. The alarm went off at 6. He got up, showered, put on the suit he'd bought 3 weeks ago, not expensive, just adequate, clean, and dark, and made coffee and left a note for Ruth about Lily's breakfast and drove to Ashford Industries in the early morning dark. Bam. The board meeting was at 9. Mason arrived at 8 and went to the project office and sat at his desk and didn't pretend to work because pretending felt dishonest. At 8:40, he walked to the elevator, rode to the 14th floor, and went to the anteroom outside the main boardroom where Adrienne was already waiting. She looked exactly like she always looked. No different for the occasion, which he respected. She had a briefcase and a coffee and an expression of professional composure that he suspected was as natural to her as breathing. "Morning," she said. "Morning. Sleep?" "Some." "Good enough." She opened the briefcase, checked something inside, closed it. "I've confirmed with the board secretary that the evidentiary materials are loaded on the presentation system. Locked. Only the board secretary and I have access until the meeting opens." "Mercer doesn't know." "He knows something's on the agenda under incident review because that's on the standard board docket. He doesn't know the scope." She looked at him. "How are you?" It was a question she didn't usually ask, which meant she was asking it on purpose. "Ready," he said. "Good." She paused. "You don't have to speak today if you don't want to. The documentation speaks. Evelyn speaks. I speak. You can be a witness." "I know," he said, "but I'm going to speak." She studied him for a moment. "Okay," she said, "then speak last, after everything's been presented, after he's had a chance to respond." She held his gaze. Let him talk first. He understood why. He nodded. At 8:55, Evelyn came through the hallway in the specific way she navigated spaces. Efficient, without ceremony, already in the meeting before the meeting started. She looked at Mason once, briefly, and it said something that would have been hard to put into words. Something like, "We're here, we did the work, let it hold." He nodded once. She went in. The boardroom at Ashford Industries held 12 people around the central table and additional seating along the walls. There were 7 independent directors, 2 executive directors besides Evelyn, and 3 committee members who attended in advisory capacity. Grant Mercer sat 3 seats to Evelyn's left, in the chair he always occupied, with the ease of someone who has sat in a particular chair for 9 years and has stopped noticing it. The meeting opened with the standard items: financial review, committee reports, a capital expenditure approval that took 12 minutes. Mason sat along the wall beside Adrienne and kept his hand still in his lap and watched the room. Mercer was attentive, composed, speaking when spoken to with the practiced authority of a man who understood boardrooms the way Mason understood structural systems. From the inside, from long experience with where the weight sat. He glanced at Mason once, early in the meeting, with the pleasant neutrality that Mason had come to understand was Mercer's most dangerous register. Evelyn called the East Wing project to the agenda at 10:15. She presented the project status first, the phases, the timeline, the budget performance. She presented it herself, without notes, with the clean precision of someone who has memorized numbers because she finds them genuinely important. The project was on pace to complete 3 weeks ahead of schedule. The projected cost savings against the original modernization budget were significant, and when she put the figure on the screen, several of the directors leaned forward slightly. Then she said, "I need to address the incident that occurred during Phase 1. She walked through it. The accident, Marcus Webb's injuries, the mandatory safety review. She presented the materials lab report, the finding of chemical exposure, the chain of custody. She was measured and clear and gave the board exactly what they needed to understand what the lab report said without telling them what to conclude from it. The room changed texture when she put the lab report on the screen. Mason felt it. Not dramatically, not a single visible shift, but the kind of atmospheric change that happens in a room when people's internal assessments are recalibrating. One of the independent directors, a woman named Patricia Souza, who had been on the board for 6 years and had the reputation of asking the questions other people were calculating the cost of. This indicates deliberate interference with the structural assembly. The materials analysis is conclusive on the presence of a corrosive compound applied externally, Evelyn said. The interpretation of how and why it was applied is what the subsequent investigation addressed. And that investigation, Patricia said, who conducted it? The primary investigation was led by Mason Calloway, the project infrastructure lead, with support from a certified materials laboratory and independent legal counsel. Evelyn paused. I'm going to turn this portion of the presentation over to counsel. Adrienne stood. She presented the footage. She presented the forensic analysis. She presented it the way former prosecutors present evidence, with the specific density of someone who has learned that clarity is more powerful than drama, that a fact stated plainly carries more weight than the same fact announced. She identified the figure in the footage. She displayed the forensic analysis summary. She stated the confidence rating. She stated the name. Grant Mercer's expression didn't change. That was the thing Mason watched for most carefully, and it was the thing that told him the most. Because a person who is genuinely innocent would have reacted. Surprise, denial, some version of shock at being named in a criminal finding in front of a board of directors. What Mercer did was something different. His face went very still, very controlled, in the way that faces do when the person wearing them is performing, not reacting. Patricia Souza said, Mr. Mercer, do you want to respond to what's been presented? Mercer straightened in his chair. I think this is, he started. He paused, recalibrated. This is a significant allegation, and I think the board deserves to understand the context. What context? Patricia asked. The context of the investigation itself. Who conducted it, and under what authority? He looked at Evelyn with the controlled pleasantness. The appointment of a custodial employee to a senior project role was already irregular. The subsequent investigation being led by that same employee into allegations that happened to target the individual most vocal about questioning that appointment. He paused for effect. I think the board needs to consider whose interest this investigation serves. It was a good move. Mason had expected it, had talked it through with Adrienne twice, but it was still a good move, delivered well, and he watched two of the directors' faces shift slightly in the direction of consideration. Mercer continued, I wasn't in the East Wing basement on the night in question. I can provide documentation of my whereabouts, and I'd note that the security footage from that camera system, he gestured at the screen where the paused footage still showed, has not been independently authenticated by the company's own security infrastructure. He stopped. Adrienne said calmly, the footage authentication report is in the evidentiary package, Mr. Mercer. It was authenticated by a certified digital forensics firm, and the chain of custody is documented from the point of extraction from the building's security system under direct facilities management supervision. She clicked to the relevant page. But I'm curious about something you just said. Mercer looked at her. You said the security footage from that camera system hasn't been independently authenticated. Her voice was even. How did you know the footage came from that specific camera system? The room was very quiet. The footage was identified in the presentation as East Wing basement, Mercer said after a beat. The presentation identified the location as the north corridor of the East Wing basement, Adrienne said. It didn't identify the specific camera. The camera designation is in the authentication report, which is in the evidentiary package, which was locked until this meeting. She looked at him without apparent hostility. The building has 14 cameras in the basement level, Mr. Mercer. You named the right system. The silence that followed was a different kind than any that had come before it. Mercer said nothing. His mouth opened slightly and then closed. It was a small thing, a moment, maybe 2 seconds, but in a boardroom full of people trained to read exactly that kind of moment, 2 seconds was sufficient. Patricia Souza said quietly, "I think we need to pause for an executive session." Martin. Mason waited in the anteroom for an hour and 20 minutes. Adrienne sat beside him for the first 40 minutes, then took a call and stepped down the hall. He sat alone in the anteroom with 2 chairs and a side table with a dead plant on it. Someone had forgotten to water it for what looked like several weeks, and there was something almost companionable about it. The 2 of them sitting there equally uncertain what came next. He thought about the moment Mercer's mouth had opened and closed. He hadn't felt satisfaction exactly. He'd felt something more like the specific relief of structural confirmation, the feeling you get when a load-bearing calculation resolves correctly, when the numbers hold the weight they're supposed to hold. Adrienne came back. She sat down. "How are you doing?" "Fine," he said. "How do you think it's going?" "Can't know until they come out," she said. "But Mercer's attorney is going to be getting a call this afternoon, regardless of what the board decides." "Is there a version where the board doesn't act?" She thought about it, the honest version of the pause. There are directors in there who have relationships with Mercer going back years. People don't like their assessments of other people being proved wrong by documentary evidence. It's uncomfortable. Some of them are going to want a way to resolve this that doesn't require them to admit they were wrong about him. She looked at the dead plant. But Patricia Souza is not that kind of person, and she has significant influence on this board. And the camera detail. She stopped. "He gave himself away," Mason said. "He did," she agreed, and everyone in that room saw it happen. The boardroom door opened at 12:40. Evelyn came through first. She looked at Mason, and her expression told him enough before anything else did. She was controlled, composed, but there was something around the edges of it, not quite relief, more like the way a person looks when something very heavy has been set down after a very long time of carrying it. "The board has voted to place Grant Mercer on immediate administrative leave pending a formal investigation," she said. "The findings have been referred to the company's legal department and to the city attorney's office." She paused. "He'll be removed from his position. That's effectively certain." Mason nodded. "You're not going to say anything?" she asked. He thought about what there was to say. He thought about Marcus Webb and the forensic report and the 14 maintenance reports that had sat unprocessed in a filing system for years. He thought about the dead plant on the side table and the engineering exam and Lily's 7 lines and Ruth's blurry photographs. "The Phase 2 schedule needs to be updated," he said. "We lost 3 days to the safety review extension. I want to make it up in the mechanical sequencing on the north side." Evelyn looked at him. Something shifted in her face. The same thing he'd seen in her office the morning he'd laid out the evidence. The same thing he'd been unable to name then and still couldn't entirely name now. It was something that had to do with recognition, he thought, being seen a particular way, the accurate way, and having that be rare enough that it mattered when it happened. "Okay," she said, "then let's talk about the Phase 2 schedule." Adrienne looked at both of them with the expression of someone who has participated in the climax of a situation and finds the denouement unexpectedly humanizing. She said nothing, which was the right call. They walked down the hallway together, Evelyn and Mason toward the elevator, and the building around them was doing what buildings do. Its systems running, its air cycling, its structural loads distributed exactly as calculated. Mason had always found that settling. The way a building just worked, continuously, whether anyone was paying attention or not. The elevator opened. The weeks after the board meeting had their own particular texture, the texture of aftermath, of things that had been moving fast suddenly required to move carefully. The city attorney's office opened a formal inquiry into the East Wing basement incident within 5 days. Adrienne handled Mason's involvement in that process, which meant his role was primarily documentation and availability for interviews. He gave his interview on a Thursday morning in a city office building downtown and answered questions for 2 hours in the specific way he answered most questions, directly, without elaboration, sticking to what he knew and saying clearly when he didn't know something. The interviewer, a deputy city attorney named Flores, who had reviewed the evidentiary package in advance, was efficient and thorough and didn't waste his time, which he appreciated. He called Marcus Webb after the interview. Marcus answered on the 3rd ring. He was home. The surgery had gone well, recovery progressing, physical therapy starting the following week. The legal thing is moving, Mason told him. The city's involved now. You're going to be contacted for a statement. Already were, Marcus said. Yesterday. A pause. Mason? Yeah. What you did, the investigation, all of it. He stopped. Denise wanted me to call. I wasn't sure what to say. You don't have to say anything, Mason said. I know, but I want to. The sound of Marcus shifting, carefully. I've worked construction for 8 years. I've had supervisors who would have let the safety review go to the minimum standard and moved on. Who would have said, these things happen. He paused. You didn't do that. Mason sat with that for a moment. I told you the site was safe, he said. It wasn't. I needed to know why. That's not why you did it. He didn't argue the point because Marcus was probably right. How's the kid? He said. The one who just started walking. Marcus made a sound that was mostly a laugh. Walking into everything. My mother-in-law says he's exactly like me. I don't know if that's a compliment. Probably both, Mason said. Marcus laughed fully this time, which sounded like it cost him something in the ribs, and they talked for another 10 minutes about the site and the Phase 2 schedule, and when Marcus thought he'd be cleared to come back, and by the end of it, something that had been sitting in Mason's chest for weeks, not quite guilt, but something adjacent to responsibility, had eased. What? The East Wing modernization project completed on a Tuesday, 22 days ahead of the original schedule. The final inspection was a 3-hour walkthrough that Mason did with Bev and Diane Wu, who had come in person because she said she wanted to see the finished system, not a report about it. They walked every corridor of the East Wing, from the basement level, cleared and certified by the city's safety office 6 weeks prior, to the 4th floor mechanical systems, and Diane Wu asked specific, intelligent questions at each station, and Bev answered most of them, and Mason filled in the technical specifications when they got into the engineering details. At the end of the walkthrough, Diane stood in the East Wing lobby and looked at the building around her with the expression of someone doing arithmetic and arriving at a figure that was larger than they'd budgeted for. This is significant work, she said. The HVAC routing alone is going to change our maintenance cost profile for the next 10 years. 12, Bev said, conservatively. The original estimate for this project was, I know what the original estimate was, Mason said. We came in about $2.3 million under it. Diane looked at him. She'd known him for months now, had worked alongside the project in a supervisory capacity since the early meetings. But there were still moments when she looked at him with something that hadn't quite resolved. Not skepticism anymore, but the residue of where skepticism had been before it ran out of evidence to sustain itself. Phil Garrett told me, she said, that you filed 19 maintenance reports in 3 years. 15 of them weren't processed, Mason said. She nodded slowly. I know, I pulled the archive. She paused. The HVAC bracket fix was in one of those reports. 14 months before you were on this project. 11 months, Mason said. I filed it twice. She absorbed that. Then she said, I owe you something. You don't. An acknowledgement, at least. He thought about it. Then I'll take the acknowledgement, he said. And then we move on. She accepted that with a short nod, the way people accept things when they know they're getting off light and are grateful for it without quite being able to say so. Bev, who had watched this exchange with her green glasses on, said nothing. She wrote something on her clipboard. She had what might have been a small smile, though with Bev it was sometimes hard to be sure. The engineering degree came through 6 weeks after the project completed. He'd re-enrolled in the final semester at NC State through the Extended Studies program, which allowed working adults to complete remaining coursework on an adjusted schedule, and he'd carried 3 courses while running the East Wing project. Structural dynamics, which he'd already passed, materials science, and a technical communications course that he'd found easier than expected because it turned out that writing clear maintenance reports for 3 years was decent preparation for technical writing. The grades posted on a Friday morning. He checked them on his phone in the parking lot of the grocery store, which was where he happened to be, which seemed like the kind of mundane detail that a more cinematic version of events would have tidied up. But that was simply true. He sat in the trucks for a few minutes. Then he called Ruth. "I finished," he said when she picked up. A silence. Then Ruth made a sound that wasn't words, which was something Mason had only heard from her a handful of times, and he understood it to mean something significant was being felt, and she was letting it be felt rather than converting it into language. "She would have," Ruth started. "Yeah," he said. "I know." "I'm going to make that soup tonight," Ruth said. "You're coming for dinner." It wasn't a question. "Yeah," he said. "We'll be there." He sat in the truck for another minute. Outside, people were loading groceries into their cars. A kid was losing an argument with his mother about something in a cart. A man was trying to get a shopping cart back into the corral with one hand while holding his phone with the other. The parking lot of a grocery store on a Friday morning, doing exactly what it always did, indifferent to the specific weight of what had just happened to one person sitting in a truck in Space 37. He started the truck. He went to get the groceries. That afternoon, he picked Lily up from school. She got into the truck with the accumulated momentum of a child who has been holding in the events of an entire school day and releases them in one sustained narrative the moment a parent is available as an audience. He listened while she told him about a disagreement at lunch and a project on weather systems that she found more interesting than she'd expected, and a new library book that she'd already decided was the best one she'd read this year, which she said approximately every 3 weeks about a different book. They were at a red light when he said, "I finished my degree today." She stopped mid-sentence about the library book. She looked at him with the full, focused attention that she brought to things that mattered. "The engineering one?" she said. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "So now you're an engineer?" "Officially." Another pause. "Were you always one, like before it was official?" He thought about that. About the maintenance reports and the supply closet and the cardboard calculations and the 11 years of knowing things nobody asked him about. "Sort of," he said. "Yeah." She looked out the window for a moment at the street going by. Then she said, in the voice she used when she'd concluded something and was stating the conclusion rather than working toward it, "I knew that." "Yeah?" he said. "You always knew how things worked," she said, "even when you were just fixing stuff." She turned back to her window. "Can we get ice cream?" "Ruth's making soup for dinner." "Ice cream before soup." He looked at her. She looked at him with the expression she'd inherited from her mother, the one that had a very particular answer embedded in it and was waiting for you to catch up. "1 scoop," he said. "2. 1.5. "Deal," she said immediately, which meant she'd been aiming for 1.5 from the beginning. He turned toward the ice cream place on Cedar Street, and Lily went back to telling him about the library book, and the afternoon light came through the truck windows at the low angle it took in early fall. And Mason drove and listened and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way you do when life is not in crisis, and the absence of crisis is itself a thing worth noticing. He was an engineer. He had a daughter who negotiated in good faith and read a book a week and knew things about him he hadn't known she knew. He had a project that had finished right, under budget, ahead of schedule, with the full structural load held exactly where it was supposed to be. He had done the work, all of it, in the right order, without cutting corners on the parts that mattered. That was enough. For now, in the truck with the ice cream place 3 blocks ahead and Ruth's soup waiting and the late afternoon light doing what light did in early fall, it was enough, and he let himself know it was enough, which was its own kind of skill, and one that had taken him longer to develop than the engineering. The annual company celebration at Ashford Industries had always been, by Evelyn's own private assessment, the event she found most difficult to calibrate. Not because she was bad at public occasions, she wasn't. She had learned to navigate them with the same disciplined efficiency she brought to board meetings and quarterly reviews. But because celebrations required a register of openness that she had spent most of her adult life systematically closing off. You had to mean it at a celebration. You couldn't just perform it. People could tell the difference, and Evelyn had always known that she was better at meaning things than at showing she meant them, which created a particular kind of gap that she had mostly filled with professionalism and let people interpret as they needed to. This year was different. She had known it would be different for a while, in the specific way you know things that you're not quite ready to say out loud. The event was held in the main atrium of the Ashford Industries building, A space Mason had walked through at 4 in the morning 100 times, pushing a mop cart, knowing its load paths and drain locations, and the exact places where the ventilation didn't reach properly. It had been decorated for the occasion in a way that was tasteful and not excessive, which reflected a conscious decision Evelyn had made when planning it. No theater, just the building and the people in it and the things that had actually happened over the past year. There were 240 people in the atrium. Mason stood near the back, near the east corridor entrance, because that was where he had gravitated without thinking about it. The habit of standing at the edges of rooms was 11 years old and did not dissolve overnight just because the circumstances had changed. Bev was beside him, with her blue glasses on, which he had come to understand meant she was in a receiving mode rather than an analytical one. Theo was somewhere in the middle of the crowd, easy to spot because he was slightly taller than everyone around him, and moved at his characteristic single speed, regardless of whether the occasion called for urgency. Marcus Webb was there too, near the front, with his arm out of the surgical brace as of 3 weeks ago, and his physical therapy going well enough that he'd been cleared for light work. He'd come back to the site last week for a half day, and Mason had watched him do a walkthrough of the East Wing basement with the specific attention of a person who has personal reasons to look at a space carefully, and had said nothing until Marcus stopped at the North Corridor and stood there for a moment. "Solid," Marcus had said, eventually. "Solid," Mason had confirmed. That was the whole conversation. It was sufficient. Evelyn spoke from a small platform at the north end of the atrium. She didn't use notes, which Mason had expected. She gave the year's figures first: revenue, project completions, the East Wing modernization numbers, the cost savings that had now been fully audited and confirmed at a figure that made several people in the audience visibly recalculate something. She spoke about the city safety inquiry, briefly and without euphemism, stating plainly that a former executive had been found to have interfered with construction safety systems and was facing criminal charges, and that the company had cooperated fully with the investigation and would continue to do so. She said this in the same measured register she used for the revenue figures, which was the right register, neither minimizing it nor dramatizing it, just accounting for it as a fact of the year that deserved to be named. Then she paused. It was a real pause, not a rhetorical one. Mason had been around her long enough now to know the difference. The rhetorical pause was controlled, built for effect. This one was something she was moving through, a moment of finding the right footing before stepping forward. "I want to talk about something I don't think I've said clearly enough," she said, "about what this year actually taught me." The atrium was quiet in the way large rooms get quiet when they sense that the person speaking is about to say something true rather than something prepared. "I've run this company for 7 years," she said. "I know how to read a balance sheet and a market position and a personnel file. I thought I knew how to identify talent." She stopped. "I was missing most of it. I was looking in the places where talent announces itself, where it has credentials and titles and the right kind of history. I wasn't looking in the places where it just quietly does the work regardless of whether anyone's paying attention." Several people in the audience glanced toward the back of the room. Mason kept his eyes on Evelyn. "Mason Calloway submitted 15 maintenance reports to this company over 3 years," she said. 14 of them were never processed. One of them described, in precise technical detail, a drainage correction that would have cost less than $1,000 and would have prevented the accident that almost killed me on the loading dock this January. She paused. "I'm standing here this year, standing in a building that is structurally sounder and operationally better than it's been in a decade. Because one person kept filing reports that nobody read, kept showing up and doing the work right, kept being exactly who he was regardless of what job title was on his badge." She looked out at the room. "The greatest thing I've learned about leadership this year is that it has almost nothing to do with authority," she said. "Authority is just the mechanism. What actually moves things, what actually makes something better rather than just bigger, is character. It's the quality of the person who decides to do the right thing when it costs them, when it's inconvenient, when nobody in the room is treating them like their opinion counts." She stopped. "We almost didn't see that. We almost missed it entirely. That should keep all of us up at night." The applause when it came was genuine, not the polite kind that fills the space between a speaker finishing and the next thing starting, but the kind that has weight behind it. Mason stood at the back of the room and let it happen around him and felt something he couldn't entirely name, not embarrassment, not pride exactly, Something more complicated, something that had to do with the specific strangeness of being seen after a long period of not being seen and not yet knowing what to do with the visibility. Bev said, beside him, without looking at him, "Don't make a face." "I'm not making a face. You're doing the thing where you look like you want to be somewhere else." "I'm fine." "I know you're fine. Stop looking like you're calculating the load tolerance of the nearest exit." He almost smiled. "The East Corridor can handle it," he said. "I checked." After the formal program ended, the atrium shifted into the looser, louder register of people released from collective attention into individual conversation. Mason spent 20 minutes talking to people he'd worked with on the project, which was easier than the public recognition had been because it was just work talk. Theo had a timeline question about the Phase 3 scope that hadn't been resolved. One of the contract engineers wanted to discuss a systems approach he'd been thinking about for a different project. Priya asked about mentorship programs with the specific directness of someone who had been building toward the question for a while and had finally decided to just ask it. He answered her honestly. "I'll think about what that looks like," he said. "I don't know yet what I have to offer beyond what I've been doing." "That's enough," Priya said. "That's more than enough, actually." He didn't know what to do with that, so he nodded and moved on, which was his standard response to things he didn't know what to do with. Evelyn found him near the East Corridor at the edge of the thinning crowd, maybe an hour after the program ended. Most of the senior staff had filtered toward the catering tables and the clusters of conversation that formed and reformed in the post-event social geometry. The two of them stood at the edge of it in the particular way they had always stood at the edges of things, not quite separate from what was happening, but not fully absorbed by it either. "Good speech," he said. "I meant it," she said, in a tone that was slightly irritated in the way she got when she thought she was being given less than she'd offered. "I know you meant it," he said. "That's why it was good." She accepted that. She was in the formal version of herself tonight, the CEO presentation, composed and exact. But he had been around her enough to see through the presentation to the person behind it, which was someone somewhat less composed and considerably more interesting. "The board approved the new division this morning," she said, formally. "Engineering and infrastructure development." She paused. "With you as director." He'd known it was coming. She told him 2 weeks ago that it was under consideration, and the board meeting outcome had been fairly predictable once the East Wing numbers were confirmed. Knowing something is coming and having it arrive were still different things, and he felt the arrival of it, not as triumph, but as weight. The good kind. The kind that means something is real and therefore carries consequence. "I'm going to need to build the team from scratch," he said. "I know. The budget allocation in the proposal is probably too conservative for what the division actually needs to do." "I know that too. Make the case and I'll fight for the revision." "And the mandate has to be real," he said. "Not a showcase division. If it's just optics." "Mason." She said his name in the tone she used when he was working the problem past the point where working it was useful. "I didn't create this because it looks good. I created it because the company needs it, and because you're the right person to run it." She looked at him directly, with the clear-eyed honesty that was the most consistent thing about her. "Do you trust that?" He thought about it, not because he was uncertain, but because she deserved an honest answer rather than a quick one. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Something in her face settled. Not relaxed. She didn't really relax. He'd come to understand that about her. But settled, the way a structure settles when its loads are distributed correctly. "Lily's play was 3 weeks ago," she said. "How did it go?" The shift caught him, the way it sometimes did when she moved between registers. CEO, then person, then CEO again. The transitions happening without apparent seam. He'd been learning her transitions over months and still sometimes missed them. "She was great," he said. 7 lines, all delivered with complete authority. Ruth took about 12 photos, 9 of which were blurry. "Did you get a good one?" "One. Her in the hat." "Send it to me," she said, and then seemed to hear how that sounded and looked slightly to the left of him in the way she did when she'd said something that revealed more than she'd intended. He didn't make anything of it. "Yeah," he said. "I will." They stood in the thinning atrium for a moment, with the sound of the event winding down around them. Glasses, voices, the particular acoustic of a large room slowly emptying. The east wing was visible through the corridor behind Mason, its new systems running quietly behind the walls, doing what they were supposed to do without announcement. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said. "Yeah." "When you were filing those reports, the 15 that went nowhere." She was looking at the floor, at the atrium's original tile that Mason had buffed himself more times than he could count. "Did you ever think about stopping?" He considered the question. It was a real one, and it deserved a real answer. "Sometimes," he said, "I'd think, what's the point? Nothing happens. But then I'd walk past whatever the problem was, the drainage, the brackets, the electrical routing, and I'd think about what happens if it fails, and I'd write the report, even knowing it wouldn't be read. The report being read wasn't the point," he said. "The report was the point. Knowing I'd said what needed to be said, that was enough to keep going." She was quiet for a moment, then, "That's not a common way to be." "I know," he said. "I don't think I chose it. I think it's just how I'm built." Well, she looked at him then. Really looked, the full attention she brought to things that mattered. And he looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there wasn't anything that needed to be said that hadn't already been established over the course of everything that had happened between January and now. The loading dock and the maintenance reports, and the conference room, and the basement, and the board meeting, and everything since. It was all there, in the space between them, readable if you knew what you were looking at. "I spent a lot of years behind the armor," she said. It was the most personal thing she'd said to him, and she said it the way she did most things, directly, without preamble, like she'd decided to say it and then said it rather than building to it. After the accident, it was useful for a long time. "Yeah," he said, "I can see that." "It stopped being useful," she said. "Somewhere around this year. I didn't notice when it happened exactly." He thought about Caroline, about Lily, about the long project of learning to carry things without making them your whole identity. "Those things usually shift without announcing it," he said. "You just look back at some point and realize the weight's different." She nodded. Something in her eyes, brief and unguarded, that was whatever Evelyn Ashford looked like when she wasn't managing herself. He'd seen it a few times now. He recognized it. "Come have dinner sometime," she said. "Not a meeting, just dinner." It wasn't a dramatic offer. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, without performance. And he understood that the plainness of it was the point. That after everything, after the armor and the distance and the months of being professional and careful and exactly calibrated, this was her version of crossing the distance, simple and direct, and offered without guarantee of anything. "Okay," he said. "Lily too, if you want." "She'll have opinions about the restaurant," he said. "Fair warning." "I can handle opinions," Evelyn said. "She'll want to explain the entire book she's reading." "I like books," Evelyn said. And then, quietly, with something that was finally unmistakably a smile, "I think I can keep up." He left the building at 8:30. The night was cool, early fall edging toward real autumn, the kind of air that has weight to it after summer's flatness. The parking lot held only a few cars now. His truck was where he'd left it, space 31, because he had a consistent habit, and the habit didn't require thought, which was the point. He sat in the truck for a moment before starting it, looked at the building. The east wing was lit from inside, its new systems running, the properly configured drain on the loading dock invisible in the dark, but there, functioning, no longer an 11-day-old maintenance report waiting for someone to care. The building looked, from the outside, exactly like it always had. That was the nature of infrastructure work. You did it right, and what you got for it was that everything looked normal, nothing dramatic. Just a building that worked, serving the people in it, doing its job without anybody having to think about it. He had spent 11 years being that, functioning, unremarkable from the outside, doing the work regardless of whether anyone was watching. He wasn't sure what to call what he was now. The title was director. The credential was engineer. But those were just designations, just the official language for a thing that was harder to name. He was someone who had kept showing up, who had written the reports and done the work, and refused to let what other people failed to see become what he failed to be. That wasn't heroism. He resisted the word because it didn't fit the texture of the thing. Heroism implied a moment, a decision, a line crossed. This had been something slower and less dramatic than that. It had been 1,000 small choices made in hallways and stairwells and supply rooms and kitchen tables, mostly invisible, mostly uncelebrated, adding up to something that turned out to matter. The hard truth about character, the thing nobody tells you because it doesn't make a clean story, is that you don't get to know while you're building it whether it's going to count for anything. You just build it. You show up. You tell the truth. You do the work right, even when wrong would be easier and invisible would be safer. And most of the time, nothing dramatic happens. Most of the time, it's just the quiet accumulation of a life being lived with some integrity in it, and that's enough. And the enoughness of it is not a consolation prize. It's the whole thing. He started the truck. He had promised Lily he'd be home by 9, and he was going to make it with 12 minutes to spare, which was not the kind of thing that would make a story anyone would tell. Just a father coming home on time. The ordinary machinery of a life running the way it was supposed to run. He pulled out of the lot. The building receded in the rearview mirror, its east wing lit and solid and built correctly. And he drove through the city toward his daughter and the ordinary evening ahead, and he did not look back again because what was behind him had been handled, and what was in front of him was what he was driving toward. And the difference between those two things was the whole point. At a red light 2 blocks from the apartment, he picked up his phone and sent Evelyn the photograph of Lily in the cartographer's hat. The light turned green. He drove home.